Hello, everyone. Am I coming through? Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. We're at Rice University's Baker Hall, and welcome to also those who are joining us online. I'm Neil Lane, Senior Fellow in Science Technology at Rice University at the Baker Institute of Public Policy, and longtime faculty member at Rice and long retired from the faculty, I might add. On behalf of the Institute, it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's panel discussion, Science Under Siege, with Dr. Peter Hotez and Dr. Michael Mann, two eminent scientists who fearlessly fight anti-science propaganda and influencers and suffer slings and arrows for their efforts. They have co-authored a new book, Science Under Siege, How to Fight the Five Most Powerful Forces That Threaten Our World, which was released today and will be available for purchase and for signing after the discussion. I think you'll find their book highly informative, richly sourced, and timely, to say the least. And they pull no punches, so I promise you a good time in this book. Science has been attacked at least since the time of Galileo, whenever truth gets in the way of powerful people or institutions. But today, I think one can argue is a different and in some ways more threatening time for humanity than in times past. Our speakers can tell us if I'm right or wrong about that. Today's event is part of the Baker Institute Civic Scientist Lecture Series, which receives support from Rice University's Weiss School of Natural Sciences and the Brown School of Engineering, as well as our generous donors, Virginia Clark and Benjamin and Winifred Chang. The event is also part of the Baker Institute's Director Series, so we can thank Ambassador Satterfield for today's lunches. Before we start, I would like to thank the Baker Institute staff, especially Kaylee Wadrup and Laura Holtz, for their support in organizing today's event. So Dr. Hotez is a world-renowned physicist, scientist, and leader in global health and vaccine development, and a tireless advocate for science communication. He is also a science fellow in science and humanity at the Baker Institute and a colleague of the Science and Technology Policy Program. Many of you know him, especially for his courageous efforts to combat misinformation during the pandemic and since, and for his decades of work developing viruses for neglected tropical diseases, reached millions across the world. Dr. Mann is one of the world's most influential climate scientists. His pioneering research on climate change has shaped our understanding of global warming, and he has long been at the forefront of communicating the urgency of climate action. He is also a powerful public voice, pushing back against efforts to undermine science in the public square. Dr. Mann is famous for his so-called hockey stick plot of average global temperatures across the globe over the past 1,000 years, showing a slow cooling trend until fairly recently, a century ago, when temperatures began to shoot up rapidly. Together, our speakers bring expertise from two of the most critical arenas where science has come under attack, both public health and climate. And we're going to start with a few prepared questions and then move on to the questions from the audience. So please submit your questions using the QR here on the event slide. Do we have the event slide? Okay. I do not see the QR. Does anybody see the QR on the event slide? Oh, okay, you've got it coming in. Thank you very much. I'll start with a few general questions, and then we'll turn to your questions, which I'm particularly anxious to present. If you have multiple questions, feel free to submit them, but I'm only going to be able to get to the ones that we have time for. The link is also posted online for those of you who are watching us virtually. So now I'd like you to please join me in welcoming Dr. Peter Hotez and Dr. Michael Mann as they join me on the platform.
Which one are you sitting at?
Either one on this side.
This, okay. That's it.
So welcome, gentlemen. Welcome, Dr. Mann and Dr. Hotez. We're delighted to have you with us. Very anxious to get to the questions. Let me just start with, I think, an easy one, although it can't have been all that easy. How did you two meet and decide to work together, write this book? Why now? So let me start with Dr. Mann and then turn to you, Peter.
Sure, and thanks for hosting this event, to the Baker Institute. Thanks to you for moderating this conversation. I've long appreciated your work in the climate policy arena, and it's a delight to be here with all of you today. So Peter and I sort of got to know each other because back in the early days of COVID, we were both fairly interactive on social media, on Twitter, for example, before it was the cesspool that it now is. But it was starting to become that cesspool. I was noticing that fellow scientists, public health scientists like Peter, were being attacked and vilified in precisely the same way that we climate scientists had been attacked decades ago. So I suppose you could say it was sort of a PTSD for me to watch that happening. I forget whether I first reached out to Peter or he reached out to me. We can't even remember. But we were sort of drawn to each other. I would say we are sort of brothers in arms in the sense that we're in two different areas of science where powerful ideological forces, and we detail those forces in the book, have found it to their benefit, have seen it as being to their advantage to undermine public faith and understanding in certain areas of science that might challenge their ideological or political agenda or views. And so it was sort of interesting for us to sort of both compare and contrast. Obviously, climate science and vaccine science are two completely different areas of science. And yet, one of the things that we realized were the tactics that were used to undermine public understanding, to discredit the scientists, were very similar in these two areas. Many of the same players, many of the same forces behind anti-science in these two areas are the same. And maybe we'll get into that later on. Why is it that the same people who would want to discredit the science of climate change want to discredit vaccines? Why? It's sort of odd but it turns out that there are some reasons, and maybe we'll get into that.
I seem to remember, Michael, and I really got talking, it was a couple of years ago, there was this big push for me to debate Robert F. Kennedy Jr. on the Joe Rogan show when he was running for president, and then Elon Musk weighed in and claimed I was hiding something by refusing to debate Robert F. Kennedy Jr., which I didn't want to legitimize him as president. We can talk about it a little later. I had spoken to him for a whole year before and knew he had no interest in the science, so I didn't want to legitimize his presidency. I also thought it sent the wrong message to young scientists that that's how we do science. We debate with crackpots, and that's not how we debate. That's not how science is done, right?
And so you might catch that brainworm.
There are. In the 1920s, there were famous discussions between Niels Bohr and Einstein over quantum physics and whether it was wave theory or whether it was the matrices. But those were discussions between two colleagues who respected and valued each other. This was not how we do science, and I thought that sent the wrong message. Anyway, I couldn't and then when you look at Elon Musk and Joe Rogan and Robert F. Kennedy Jr., that's just about followed by every person on Twitter except those who were following Taylor Swift, and I said, what the heck is this? And it was Michael who kind of said, hey, we've been there, and Michael became a great trusted friend and source of wisdom to help me figure out the do's and don'ts of how to respond, because there was no precedent for that. So.
Yeah, well, and I feel the same. It's like I said, we're brothers in arms.
Because he had been through it a decade before, and then we started realizing that if you think of the attacks on biomedical science and vaccines and the attacks on climate science, like two circles of the Venn diagram, they're not completely overlapping, but there's significant overlap, and in some cases coming from the same actors. And we found that very interesting. And as we started writing the book, we realized the linkages were even more than we originally thought.
Yeah, I mean, there's some examples, just very briefly, that have played out literally within the last week or two that really underscore what we're saying. Let's take RFK Jr., of course, who's obviously very prominent in the sort of the attacks on vaccine science. Now, as HHS secretary, trying to make it more difficult for people to even get access to vaccines. So we know he's bad on COVID-19, public health science, vaccines. But some of you may have seen that he recently weighed in on wind energy. He's concerned about all the whales that are going to be killed by wind energy. I guess they get impaled on those, it doesn't make any sense. There's no science behind it whatsoever, but it's become a popular talking point among climate deniers, among opponents of clean energy who are trying to undermine clean energy to advance a fossil fuel industry agenda. Why is it that RFK Jr. is now weighing into that side of the conversation as well? Well, to understand that, you have to realize that he's part of an administration that has an agenda, that the origins of the early attacks, and Peter can sort of elaborate on that, the early attacks on vaccine science during the early days of COVID-19 were funded by the Koch brothers, the world's largest, well, there's just one brother, it's the Koch brother now, I guess, the world's largest privately held petrochemical interest. We understand why the Koch brothers have been opposed to climate science and clean energy, but why were they promoting COVID-19 misinformation?
Yeah, they were donors at what's called the American Institute for Economic Research at in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, and it was headed by someone who used to work for the Koch brothers in a different capacity. And out of there came something called the Great Barrington Declaration, signed by a number of contrarian physicians and other professionals. And kind of the theory claimed that with COVID, we'll just let all the young people run around and go to concerts and bars and things like that. Then we'll squirrel away grandma and grandpa in a closet somewhere and shove Swanson's TV dinners under the door, and everything will be fine. And epidemiologically, it made absolutely no sense. And that was, and was the Koch brothers who were supporting the American Institute for Energy Research. Why? Most likely because there was a real concern that if there were stay-at-home orders and people weren't driving cars, that the oil and gas prices would decline. And of course they did, but it was temporary and with recovery and with vaccinations. But that was an example of how the two circles of the Venn diagram start to overlap.
We're in a particularly difficult situation in this country with deep polarization, deep divides over lots of things. And you've already made clear, and certainly in your book, what a serious threat it really is to humanity for the public to misunderstand or not understand the extent to which the science in the area of climate change and medical health science in general, but also vaccines in particular, is a serious matter. What a big threat it is. But those two important areas also appear to be leading the public to mistrust science more broadly, which is sort of the larger scope of your book. And if the public loses trust in science, then it's a little hard to know how to get at that. And often extremes are used in the rhetoric, because how else are you going to get the media's attention? Will people pay any attention if one doesn't say anti-vaxxers or one says, anti-climate people, anti-climate skeptics? So how now, given the current situation, we wish it were otherwise, given the current situation, how do we engender trust in the larger public by focusing on your areas and letting that expand, or is there another strategy?
Let me just say something briefly and then let Michael weigh in. I think, first of all, the overarching premise of the book, Science Under Siege, says, well, if you look at humanity's two of our gravest threats are pandemics. We've already had COVID, now we've got H5N1, and we've got other coronaviruses brewing. We'll have mosquito-transmitted viruses. I'm concerned about yellow fever on the Gulf Coast and in Texas, and that's a huge existential threat for humankind, and then the climate crisis. But now there's a third leg to that tripod, and that's the massive anti-science disinformation campaign that prevents us from doing this. And right now, we have no pandemic preparedness in the United States government. They've shut that office down, and same with climate science. And we're already seeing this is taking lives. And so I think what we felt was a sense of urgency that it's not just an academic discussion. My estimate is 200,000 Americans minimum died during the COVID pandemic because they refused COVID vaccines. They were targeted victims of this disinformation campaign. And then and that's why we need to address it if we're going to start solving these problems. And then that brings us to the trust in science. I can't tell you how many Zoom calls I've been on about loss of trust in science and scientists. And what I say is, this was not by accident. It's not necessarily that the scientists screwed up. It's because the bad actors were weaponizing this and deliberately trying to portray scientists like the two of us as cartoon villains or public enemies. And so it's part of the anti-science ecosystem to attack the science and scientists.
Yeah, Houston, we have a problem. And as Peter laid it out, we really have three problems. We have the threat of the climate crisis, which by some measures is even more deadly than COVID-19. If you look at the total health impact of fossil fuel pollution, water and air pollution on top of the impacts of climate change. In both cases, we're talking about millions of lost lives ultimately. And so we have a problem. The bigger problem, the problem that underlies the crisis that we're in right now, is that this massive misinformation, and we call it disinformation because it's intentional misinformation, anti-science that serves an ideological agenda, it undermines our ability to act on any of the great challenges that we face, whether it's pandemics or the climate crisis. And so if we don't get a handle on that, if we don't do something about that, we will be unable to really to act on any of the great challenges and crises that we face today. And so in the end, it comes down to finding a way to restore good faith to our public discourse. And I think it's profound, frankly, that we're speaking here in the Baker Institute. James Baker was an example of what I would call an old school Republican who believed in science. He may have differed in his viewpoints about the policies that we should put in place to deal with various environmental issues, for example, but he accepted the science and he recognized, and there could be good faith differences of opinion and both sides could work together. That was sort of the era in which James Baker sort of came into the picture. And we've lost that, right? We've lost all good faith in our politics, and that partisan divide is being very carefully maintained by these bad actors who want a partisan divide. We take the press to task, frankly, and I'm not just talking about the Murdoch media, Fox News, the Wall Street Journal editorial pages. We talk about the New York Times and the Washington Post and what we call performative neutrality, false balance. And there's an example we talk about in the book where the New York Times, which has worked hard to sort of platform pseudoscientific theories like the lab leak hypothesis for COVID-19. The science doesn't support it. And yet, if you read the New York Times, there's op-ed after op-ed arguing that, that this is what's going on, that the scientists have been lying to you. And so it feeds this mistrust, it feeds this distrust. And then the New York Times has the temerity to then publish an editorial in which it criticizes scientists for creating this distrust. It's sort of victim blaming, if you ask me, because of course our media, even our legacy media, have helped create this environment, helped maintain this environment, and it's been fed by bad actors, but they're not helping. We'd like to think that we could rely upon, the gray lady, the legacy media, to litigate these matters in an objective way, but we can't anymore, and that's one of the biggest crises here, is our loss of good faith in our public discourse, and the fact that we've lost the media, the fourth estate, as it's sometimes called, as what we would have liked to have seen, something we've always believed was an ally in this sort of fight for truth and objectivity.
The audience may have noticed that we don't have another member of the panel, an anti-scientist. I mean, we like to present all sides in all of our activities, but I'll just argue, as a scientist, I think there isn't any kind of other side when one is talking about science, I think. Thank you.
Absolutely.
We asked RFK Jr. to join us. He didn't.
Read the book.
And by the way, we don't want to make this all about RFK Jr., although that's actually how I got involved in this. I was, I devoted my life to making vaccines for global health. That's why I came to the Texas Medical Center 15 years ago, an opportunity to make vaccines for parasitic diseases. That's what I wanted to do since I was an MD and PhD student in the 1980s, and this great opportunity to be part of this extraordinary Texas Medical Center, and we've been able to do things here that I couldn't do anywhere else. And we made a low-cost COVID vaccine that I've spoken about before that reached 100 million people in India and Indonesia at $2 a dose, and providing proof of concept that you could bypass big pharma and still do big things in the vaccine space. And
yet on Twitter, he's public enemy number one.
Yeah,
after doing all of that for humanity.
Because they'll say I'm a pharma shill, and even though that's the opposite, right? But that's what the narrative is. But then it was about a number of years ago, I was in my office, and I got my assistant was reading her note. She says, "Hey, Dr. Hotez, I have two gentlemen on the phone. Their names are Dr. Anthony Fauci and Francis Collins. Can you talk to them?" And I said, "Yeah, I think so." And they said, "Okay, Peter, we got a job for you. You're a vaccine scientist, you're a pediatrician, you also have a daughter. Rachel has autism and intellectual disabilities, and you can explain why vaccines don't cause autism. We're going to have you talk to Bobby," and as he was called then, and I had a year of discussions with him on cell phone, Zoom, and email, and he was deeply dug in, and he clearly did not care about the science. He did not care about autism. But I wound up writing a book about it called "Vaccines Did Not Cause Rachel's Autism," and that made me public enemy number 1 or 2 with anti-vaccine groups. But it also gave me a front row seat to watch how this thing has evolved into the monster that it is. And now the anti-vaccine monster is merged now with the climate science monster, and that has become the existential threat that we're dealing with.
We've got some excellent questions from the audience, and let me just start with one I haven't thought much about recently, just to be fair. It has to do with the issue of censorship, or at least the appearance of unwillingness to hear people, to listen. And so when one goes about, either personally or through organizations or in government, to counter anti-science arguments or views that we think professionally, or even we can show evidence, are false, falsifying science. How do we bridge this gap between free speech and listening? How do we counter disinformation without just saying, "Shut up, you don't get a time at the mic"? Mike,
Yeah,
let's start.
I'm happy to take a stab at that. I mean, I think that in some cases we're dealing with crocodile tears. Some of those who complain, who sort of an individual who bought Twitter because he felt that there wasn't that it was censoring people with certain opinions, and he framed it as a free speech sort of movement on his part. And now, of course, if you challenge some of the basic beliefs of this person, you'll get kicked off Twitter, right? Or you'll get throttled. Many of my climate scientist colleagues and I find that we don't get nearly the reach on Twitter that we used to because the algorithm has been changed, and journalists have documented this.
I
It's
never see your
objectively
stuff
true.
anymore.
Yeah, well,
I have to look for it.
Yeah, no, it's
Same with Eric Topol. I don't see his stuff anymore either.
It's pretty remarkable, and the algorithm has been tweaked to magnify misinformation and disinformation, and to minimize it. So that's not free speech.
The claims of censorship themselves are disinformation. I mean, how many times have I heard, Jay Bhattacharya, who's now NIH director, or Marty McCary, and who's FDA director, when they're on Fox News every night saying they were censored. Well, they're reaching 3.2 million Americans every night. I never got that. I mean,
I wish I was that censored.
So it's not so much that they were censored. What they were really upset about was they didn't have the endorsement of the scientific community because they were pushing
dangerous
yes. misinformation, and that's what they were really calling censorship. That their contrarian views, which had no basis, no scientific basis, and the fact that at least one was never published a scientific paper yet was pushing this stuff out, wasn't somehow blessed by the scientific community and got pushed back. That was his version of censorship.
I mean, it's a great example. We talked about the lab leak hypothesis, which is not scientifically supported. There aren't peer-reviewed articles as there are with the zoonotic, the understood mechanisms. There isn't peer-reviewed science to support that, and yet it gets even more play on social media, on Twitter, than the actual science. And the same thing with whales and windmills, right? Donald Trump and RFK Jr. talk about windmills. These aren't windmills. We're not milling grain here. They're talking about wind turbines. So let's get that straight first of all. There's literally no science behind the idea that this is impacting whales or bird populations. They love to complain about wind turbines and birds, but they conveniently ignore the fact that fossil fuel infrastructure leads to far greater numbers of bird deaths per year, as do
Peter,
house cats.
House cats.
House cats.
I love that.
But you don't see Rupert Murdoch complaining about house cats on the front pages of the...
Well, maybe that's where we ought to start. I mean, somehow we've got to get the public's attention on what's going on. But let me just sort of counter it. So you say what you say, but okay, I don't know what peer review is, and I don't know how research is done in the laboratory. We're just handing people money and letting them do whatever they want to. That's a message that seems to be coming out, and most of us don't have a way to know that's not true, except to find somebody to trust.
Yeah.
Peter?
Yeah, I think this is part of the problem, that most Americans don't know what scientists do on a day-to-day basis, and that is partly our fault as a scientific community, that we're so focused on our grants and our scientific papers and our meetings that we don't feel the urgency to communicate to the public, which was why when I came to Houston 15 years ago, I really, really wanted to be part of the Baker Institute, because I thought that was so critically important.
Of course, if we do that, of course, we get attacked and vilified.
Right.
So,
well, I like to cite. I see Rekha Lakshman, and a colleague of mine in the audience. She's heard me say this 100 times. I like to quote these surveys that Research America does, which is a policy group linked to the NIH, and they do these surveys every couple of years, and they always come out with the same number. It turns out 75% of Americans cannot name a living scientist.
And the 25% who can always name our friend Bill Nye.
Well, first they name first they name Einstein and Jonas Salk, not realizing they've moved on, and then it's Bill Nye and Neil deGrasse Tyson. And we love those two guys. They're great, but they're not scientists in the sense of slaving over major revisions of papers and lab meetings and grants that get not discussed and all the things that scientists do. And that is partly our fault, that we've made ourselves invisible. And it's also partly the fault of the university administrators, especially the academic health centers, that want to control the brand. They're obsessed with controlling the brand. They really don't want their scientists and docs out there speaking in the public. And that creates invisibility. And that gap, that darkness, allows the bad actors to portray us as doing nefarious things, walking around in white coats, plotting all sorts of terrible things. And that is a problem. And by the way, the other thing the survey does is it shows that the vast majority of Americans cannot name an institution where scientific research is conducted also. And when they go through the list, the number of people who mention Rice University, that's right, 0. Or Baylor College of Medicine, 0, and the list goes on. And so we're invisible by design, and we have to start correcting that.
Well, many scientists, of course, are being hurt, not attacked, probably in scale, either numbers of attacks or even severity of attacks as you have, but you may know other colleagues who have as well. There are many other scientists who have not been public, have not gone public in a way that's attracted such opposition. Many of them understandably are afraid. If they haven't already lost their grant, they could easily do so, because the system that we had in place for a very long, 80 years, let's say, plus a bit, is no longer there. And there are people running these organizations that don't have any history with science and how science progresses in America and how research is, all the things that we talked about earlier. One of our listeners, or maybe someone here in the audience, indicated it's kind of hard to know where to start. I mean, maybe you start in pre-K-12 in terms of critical thinking and trying to help people understand how to read what you hear and how to understand and question. Seems a kind of a long, doesn't seem like a bad idea to me, but it's going to take a long time.
It's a long road to build back critical thinking skills and get people going back to the library again and reading books and getting off.
And we don't have 18 years. We don't have 20 years. We've got to reduce carbon emissions by 50% this decade if we're going to avert catastrophic 3 degree.
Well, one of the things that Michael taught me,
Michael
taught me a lot of things writing the book, and among them he taught me this concept of doomism, which is almost as damaging as the anti-science doomism, meaning that if you just throw up your hands and say there's nothing we can do, and it's Michael that pointed out that we not only have urgency, his phrase is, that was his phrase, we have agency, and I use it all the time now, I steal it.
I get a
because it's a good one. And he's right. I mean, one of the things that I try to do with especially our young scientists in the Texas Medical Center here at Rice, sometimes they look at me like Moses in the desert, why did you bring us here? And I say,
the golden calf.
There are things that we can do, and it's not about moving to France. But we're going to have to be smarter. There are going to be significant cuts to government funding for science, both biomedical science through the NIH and through the National Science Foundation. That's pretty clear. And as long as the MAHA pseudoscience agenda, which is basically an economic stimulus plan for the health, wellness, and influencer industry, continues, that's going to be hard. So we're going to have to be more deliberate, more strategic. I think we're going to have to, it's going to mean scientists are going to have to be more entrepreneurial, looking into the private sector, looking at starting biotechs and learning that whole economic space of private equity and venture capital, and But there's a lot of it in healthcare and in biomedical science, but it's going to require some different skill sets as well.
Yeah, and let me just say, we've got to have courage. This is a moment of consequence, and we want future generations to look back and at us for having sort of been brave and having fought for democracy and trust and truth and our environment and the well-being of our fellow human being. We sort of, and this was more my doing, but I think I brought Peter along in the process. In the end, we sort of use a Tolkien-esque framing for the book, because we do see this as a pretty stark battle between good and evil, and the consequences couldn't be greater. They're literally the future of our civilization, future of humanity, the future of our planet. And so there's a line from The Lord of the Rings that has always resonated with me. You know, when times look really dark, conversations that take place, and one of the hobbits says, that when asked, like, why do we keep on fighting on when it looks overwhelming? How are we going to defeat, the forces of Mordor? There's some good in this world, and it's worth fighting for. And to me, that is the definitive line from The Lord of the Rings that speaks to us today. There's some good in this world, and it's worth fighting for.
One of the things I always say, Michael, is, and Neil, is, this is a nation built on the strengths of our research universities and institutions. And we tend to forget it, and then when I get the threatening emails saying the Army of Patriots is going to hunt me down and this kind of nonsense, I say, wait a minute, we're the patriots. It's places like Rice University and MIT and Harvard and Stanford and our great land grant universities and Penn and Iowa State University and that built the Manhattan Project and gave us victory in the Cold War and victory over cancer and HIV/AIDS, and we're the heroes, and that we have to bring that back as well. We're not the enemies.
We have to reclaim these narratives for the rightful role.
There is a connection between your two fields and the implications for society, the world. I mean, the U.S. and the world. Could you just say a word about the connections between public health and? I can start with you, Peter, and then.
One of the most common questions in terms of the links between climate change, climate crisis, and pandemics is one of the most common questions I'm asked these days is, hey, Doc, what the heck is going on? That's literally the question. And you try to say, okay, what do you really mean by that? Well, why have we had severe acute respiratory syndrome, SARS, in 2002, then Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome, then Ebola in 2014, and that's when I served on Governor Rick Perry's infectious disease task force, because we had cases in Dallas, if you remember, and then Ebola again in 2019. Now our third major coronavirus infection, which is COVID-19, H5N1, and that's the ones we know about the best, but the ones that are happening right in front of our nose is the expansion of mosquito-transmitted viruses in Brazil is going to hit Texas and the Gulf Coast. I'm worried about yellow fever and dengue and chikungunya and Zika and malaria has come back to South Texas. So what the heck is going on? And I think it's a combination of urbanization and because a lot of the Aedes aegypti mosquitoes and urbanized mosquito, but climate change is a big feature because mosquitoes like warming temperatures, and if you take a walk in your neighborhood, as I do every morning, mosquito season started sometime around February this year and now goes all the way to the end of the year. And then in terms of the respiratory viruses, the catastrophic viruses like Ebola or coronaviruses, they're natural viruses of bats. And bats now with new altered climate patterns are migrating closer to the people, and the people are coming closer to the bats because of deforestation and urbanization. So that's the reason. So there's a very intimate connection between pandemics and climate change.
Mike?
Yeah, I don't have a whole lot to add to that. We are all of these other activities that we're engaged in, deforestation, habitat destruction, climate change, is worsening, these public health problems as well. And then there's this overriding factor of misinformation and disinformation, which disables us in our ability to address either of these challenges. So it's all linked, and some of the bad actors, as we've said, are linked as well. In the end, another thing that links them is that the only true solution to this problem, I mean, in each chapter we talk about the little things that we can do to try to make some progress, but the big thing we need to do is, again, to reclaim good faith in our public discourse, to reclaim our politics for its rightful role.
We talk about science and we talk about democracy as related. Can you have one without the other?
It's a great question. I mean, we can get into Lysenkoism.
Well, we actually we have a quote in the book. I think it was from Maxim Gorky, who said, "Without science, democracy is impossible." And,
That's right.
and he said that in response to what happened during the Great Purge of Stalin in the 1930s, when ultimately they threw the Mendelian geneticist Vavilov, one of the greatest geneticists of his day, into the Gulag, where he ultimately perished in a Gulag hospital from starvation and exposure, and in favor of Trofim Lysenko, who had no credentials, and he had these phony baloney theories that you could soak the Russian wheat into snow and toughen it up so it would create a more hardy Russian wheat crop. It was all made up, and yet that's what Stalin went with, and it ultimately
But we've got
caused
China.
massive
China's going
famine.
great guns, right? Their universities are moving up
That's
in the
right.
ranks and
So
pumping money into science. I mean, not exactly a democracy, right? So you're
Well,
coming back, I think.
but the point is, this is the modus operandi of authoritarian regimes. You target the intelligentsia, you target the scientists, and Stalin figured that out. And in Weimar Germany, they called Einstein's theory of relativity the Jewish fraud, and same with psychoanalysis. So you target and there's the component of anti-Semitism. That's a whole separate discussion.
Yeah.
But
we get into it in the book.
But you attack, if you want to maintain authoritarian control, the first thing you do is you go after the scientists. That seems to be the playbook. And when you read, the writings of people like Ruth Ben-Gad or Anne Applebaum, they pick up on that very quickly. And this goes back to Hannah Arendt and the origins of totalitarianism. She picked up right.
I mean, this is, we began writing this book a year and a half ago, so we had no idea what sort of environment it would emerge in, and somehow these messages resonate so much more loudly today than we frankly imagined they would. I would have much rather have seen the book fail to find such a receptive audience today. But the sad fact is that now science is under siege in a way we couldn't have even envisioned when we first began writing this book.
Thank you both so much. It's been an extraordinary exchange, and we're very fortunate to have you with us. We hope you all will meet our co-authors and read the book.
Thank you for coming. And
Yes, thanks so much, everybody.
And thank you, Neil.
Thank you, Neil.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.